And good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the webinar and welcome to Making QSEN Learning Easier during COVID-19 by using the power of story. Today, I'm joined by two colleagues and I'm happy to introduce both of them. Dr. Mary Dolansky is a Sarah Hirsch professor at the Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing at Case Western. Also, she is the director of the QSEN Institute. Dr. Gwen Sherwood is here with us as well. She's a professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the School of Nursing, and she's an author, patient safety leader, and she's also the past vice president of Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society for Nursing. I'm Steve Powell. I'll be also a presenter and a host with you today. I am the CEO of Synensys. We're a safety management company. Also, I am the co-founder of the StoryCare system. We're also being hosted today by the QSEN Institute. A little bit of housekeeping. I also put it in the chat box that we'll be recording this session. We have begun the recording. And also, I wanted to make sure that you knew that you'll be in the listen and the view mode, but there's plenty of opportunities for interactivity today because we've got the chat box going, so feel free to chat amongst yourselves or with us. We'll be interacting in that chat box. Also, we have a Q&A box. So any question you ask, if we can't answer that question during the webinar, we'll make sure and get you an answer after the webinar. So we'll also be able to share the recording afterwards for anyone who wasn't able to come, or if you just want to get a chance to share with some colleagues as well. So hopefully also that you'll participate in our polling. We will be having a short StoryCare story that we will share that is a little story simulation that we'll be playing, an audio story. And so you may want a headset for that if that would help with your ability to listen to that story. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Professor Dolansky.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Greetings of the day to all of you from the QSEN Institute, and thank you for coming onto this important call. It was really a call about a strategy or a solution for implementation of quality and safety competencies into the work that we do. And that's really what the QSEN Institute is about. It's really trying to help nurse educators and practicing nurses to go to work not just to do their job, but to always be thinking about how to improve their work by integrating quality and safety. First, though, I'd like to just recognize all the frontline healthcare heroes and those of you who are facing, our biggest public health challenge in the past 100 years. I know we were all planning on celebrating the Year of the Nurse, and now we are really embedded in creating solutions for care delivery that is safe and of high quality. The COVID pandemic has led to many, many uncertainties, with one of them how to address in-person education, how to reopen our brick and mortar education facilities, and then how to take on the difficult task of keeping educators and our students safe. Next slide. So we now have this new normal of virtual learning. Zoom classrooms, really disruptive learning and social distancing limitations. It is just crazy. We all just shake our heads every day wondering where we are with all of this. I would like to reflect that probably most schools have just not been prepared for this rapid change in learning modalities. The new normal is accelerating our shift from the traditional classroom and the learning environment of the past to now this flipped classroom of the future, where students are spending more of their asynchronous time applying what they have learned and making sense of the daily challenge of nursing. The story at Case Western Reserve and the Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing is that we found that the delivery of didactic content wasn't effective at all. We needed to be very creative and innovative, and we needed virtual simulations and discussions that were online to really stimulate students to be thinking about different, to be thinking about the content and really what we were trying to achieve by meeting their objectives of their courses. Next slide. So the question that emerged during our quest to deliver quality education virtually was, how do we include the cues and competencies? We knew that the majority of cues and competencies are taught in the real-time, that clinical experience, but we wondered, how can we be assured that the online clinical experience substitutions got students to be systems thinkers, to make the connections to quality and safety, were exposed to the real-time situations when they needed to be thinking about quality and safety. And although we received many emails of many companies with virtual teaching solutions and had to sift through them all and figure out what might work and what might not work, none of them really seemed to address the cues and competencies up in center. And these competencies, as you know, are teamwork, collaboration, quality improvement, implementing evidence-based practice, informatics, patient safety, and patient-centered care. And so we also realized that we are all being faced with the potential new AACN re-envisioned essentials that would, again, require new learning approaches to meet these new requirements, again, within this changing landscape. So we knew that we needed new strategies. Next slide. Next slide, Steve. Yes. So we knew that everyone has a story, and that this could be a strategy. And storytelling as a educational pedagogy has been really around for 10 years and found to be very important in leveraging learning. Narrative pedagogy focuses attention on the human experience of healthcare by deriving shared meanings from interpretation of stories. This allows our students to explore the different perspectives of all those involved. That emotional experiences of participants can then be understood and conventional wisdom challenged, and new knowledge can emerge as students work together to construct their learning. And conventional pedagogy is really necessary, but really insufficient to prepare our students for future practice. So whatever the teacher said was basically what you needed to learn, and this old pedagogy really didn't help students with interpretation. Next slide. So why do stories enhance learning? Many reasons. I think even if you just think about people who do tell stories, it just is very interesting, and you just stop and pause and tune in. The storytelling is very powerful. It reaches people and engages them in longer. It embeds them deeper in the information that you're trying to attain. People who hear stories retain that knowledge a lot longer. I mean, I can remember stories in my head a lot longer than I can facts about something. And people who hear information through a story recall it with higher frequency. And then lastly, when storytelling really helps to create an advocacy in that story or the characters in that story. So it's very powerful. And I do recall that here in Cleveland at the Cleveland Clinic, Toby Cosgrove, who was the prior chief of the Cleveland Clinic, he told a story at every meeting. And his stories mainly were to get the staff who were at the meeting to really tune in to the purpose and the agenda items of that meeting. So I do believe that storytelling is very powerful, and QSEN and the AACN have really been supporting the shift to this narrative pedagogy approach for the past decade, realizing that there is so much power of storytelling to help us with critical thinking, help us with systems thinking, and help us to realize the context of care in which we as nurses provide care. All right, next slide. So there is a body of research in this. So it's evidence-based. We should all be doing it. And this research is constantly expanding to demonstrate that story-based learning is in fact a very important part of our students' way to grasp the importance of quality and safety. It helps to shape the culture and the norms and beliefs, both positive and negative. And so that is the power of stories, that they can be positive or negative. So learning can occur at both ends of that spectrum. Just a couple of highlights: that storytelling has been demonstrated to be effective in adult education. Also has been shown to help people to make sense of their life situations. And our students are exposed to so many very critical life experiences, and the stories can really help them to adjust to this and cope with this. I think our students are really struggling with that right now with the COVID experience and all the challenges in life with COVID. Another highlight here is that storytelling has the power to engage the audience in their emotions and their potential to transform their own perspective and their action, helping people to see value. And another is that storytelling generates mental images and interpretations, and people kind of think back then to their own experiences and their own situations, and that really helps to make the connection to the important learning outcomes. And lastly, storytelling is a means of cultural learning and empowerment. So the stories can help us to learn other people's cultures, and it really helps to unfold clinical situations to help foster that critical thinking. Helps to unfold clinical situations that maybe a student might not be exposed to, such as an error. That helps them to kind of be exposed to that situation and think about it so that they can prevent these things in the future. So my colleague, Dr. Gwen Sherwood, and co-author, Dr. Ye, they did a very important study, and it is my pleasure to turn over then the podium to Gwen to have her share her experiences at the University of North Carolina in storytelling. Gwen?
Okay, thanks, Mary. It's a pleasure to get to be with you today and to talk about our study. I'm trying to start so you could see my picture, but I'm not able to get the video to start. So I will just talk with you and share with you about some of the framework that really meshes well with using the power of story. This particular study was using the framework of deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is practice, feedback, until you're reaching an area of mastery performance. And in this study, we were using story. We used about 10 different stories to teach SBAR. SBAR is we think of SBAR as a somewhat routine form of communication, but one of the things that we learned in doing this study is that SBAR actually requires a lot of deep reflection and deep thinking to be effective in trying to reach mastery. We know that time is very precious, especially in undergraduate programs, and our pre-licensure students often don't have enough time to really practice their interprofessional communication skills. And some of us have even heard the saying that pre-licensure students should not be allowed to talk to physicians because it would not be safe. But if they don't learn how to do this kind of communication in their undergraduate program, when are they going to begin to learn that and to be able to practice it in a safe environment? So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide so that you can see the schematic in more detail. So the way the story was constructed, we used Sakai at UNC, and so this was entirely online on Sakai. So this would be a strategy that you could use very easily as a way of increasing your contact with students. So first of all, we embedded the story, the audio, into the link on Sakai, and so our learners listened to the story. They then had to choose a point in the story where one provider needs to communicate to another provider, which is the purpose of SBAR. And so then they would record SBAR. They were then presented with a checklist, and they would do a self-assessment checklist and reflect, and they would continue to practice and repeat the cycle. And then we would play for them what we had determined was an effective SBAR from out of that particular story. And some of the new research that Dr. Ye is doing is demonstrating that that's a really effective way to provide feedback by providing feedback in more or less to the group and showing them what an effective SBAR would be, but also from looking at the responses from the student group, what are the most common mistakes, like forgetting to identify yourself or forgetting to convey some of the assessment information. So think about the different ways that you might apply this same strategy. It might not be SBAR. You might use a different kind of modality. Here you see on this slide some work by Dr. Ferranda, who was a partner in working on this research, creating a checklist. And we added an I for identification because we wanted to make sure we embedded the habit of, hello, this is Gwen Sherwood. I am a nurse from UNC Hospital, and I am from the West Unit, so that there's a clear information to the person you're calling who you are, so there cannot be confusion. We created for each of the stories what would be the critical information to convey, and then the students would be able to go back through and check that out in terms of how effective that was. So you could create this in the form of a rubric, in the form of a checklist. There are many ways that you could apply this. One other thing I will say that we found helpful for some of the stories, we developed a fake chart. So we created vital signs and some things about past history, so that if you wanted to be able to practice, the learners practice more with a truly clinical situation, there are many ways that you could adapt the story for using it this way. And if you think back to some of the things that Mary shared with us about the power of story and how this really helps learners in being able to recall information, to be able to think more deeply. And so this strategy really reflects some of the things that she was telling us. So we'll go on to the next slide, where we will be able to see a bit of a framework. If you put the QSEN competencies together in this particular format, and I'm sure that those of you who are familiar with QSEN, the Quality and Safety Education for Nurses, you've seen the 6 competencies represented in a variety of different ways. Here we're using the pillars. And so you can use the stories for really drilling deeper into the competencies. And Zoom allows you to put learners into a breakout room, and you could assign each breakout room a competency to discuss and how it's present or absent in the story, and then to rewrite the story so that the competencies are reflected in a way that would meet the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that define that competency. And in that way, they embed themselves into the story, but they also have to apply their learning and what they've been doing. So it really fits a lot with the flipped classroom that many of us have been using. And so using the breakout rooms is another way that you can apply the same concept of breakout rooms. So now we're going to go back to Steve, and I believe he's going to take us into a story.
Thanks, Gwen. All right, I'm gonna share so this is where we get a chance to play the story, and then after the story, we're gonna have an opportunity again to take that story and then be able to have a little debrief, a little reflection, take the narrative and use it from there. So I'm going to go ahead and share again, and you should be able to start hearing the story. Let me get that story going for you. And I'll ask, Gwen, if you can just make sure that the story, you're hearing the story as I start to play it. I'll get a thumbs up. That would be great. Here we go.
The ER was a beehive that afternoon. A 3-car accident downtown resulted in 7 patients being brought to their front door in a wave of ambulances. To make matters worse, it was flu season, and the waiting room was overflowing with seniors and moms with crying children. Then 2 people walked in within 15 minutes of each other complaining of chest pain, and 5 minutes later the fire department called in saying they were en route, bringing a woman with kidney failure who was in danger of cardiac arrest because she had failed to get her dialysis on time. Triage was doing its best to ensure that patients were getting roomed in a timely manner, but the stress of handling this load was wearing on everyone. To make matters worse, they were running short 2 nurses due to ill calls. Mary Hill was managing 2 patients simultaneously from the car accidents in one area of the ER and stepping across the hall to monitor one of the seniors who had come in late that morning, dehydrated and too weak to even walk. Dr. Jim Salazar finally finished up with 2 of the other car accident victims and caught up with her in the hallway. He was curt and to the point. "Where are we at with the new patients, Mary? What's your assessment?" Mary relayed her evaluation to Dr. Salazar. Mrs. Sanders, an 82-year-old female in bed 3, fell at home about 2 hours ago and has some contusions and bruising on her right side. Her right foot is very swollen at her ankle area, and she may have a broken foot, but appears to have more characteristics of a simple sprain. She's in X-ray right now per protocol. She's complaining of pain at a 5 on a 0 to 10 scale. Her blood pressure is a bit low at 92/58. We already have an IV started and infusing. Her heart rate is up at 110. She's also complaining of a headache and has a bump on her right temporal lobe. She's alert and oriented, but I'm thinking she may possibly need an MRI. Dr. Salazar thought for a moment. "Okay, sounds like a plan. Why don't you get her 2 Tylenol with codeine for the pain and run the IV at 100 cc's an hour. I'll write the order. I'll do a quick assessment myself, write the orders for the labs, X-ray, and MRI if indicated. What about the other patient?" Mary was less certain about the course of action here. Mr. Scott is a 62-year-old male who fell this morning from a short ladder, about 2 feet. He's complaining of back pain, but I can't be certain if he might also have some internal injuries. He is complaining of pain to his right side. He had a couple severe lacerations on his arm, but we were able to stop the bleeding. He'll probably need stitches on one of them. I have the suture tray set up. We have an IV started. His blood pressure is 90/60, and he's a bit tacky at 100. He's also allergic to codeine, but will need some pain medication. His family is very concerned and anxious and has been out to the nursing desk several times. Dr. Salazar nodded, wrote a quick order for IV, labs, and 2 milligrams of IV morphine, MRX1. From down the hall, Sarah Jennings, another nurse, called out urgently, "Dr. Salazar, we need you stat in room 12. Mrs. Jones has dropped her respiratory rate to 6. As he was turning to head to room 12, Mary called out, "Mrs. Hanson with the flu in room 9 needs more antiemetic. Can I give her another dose?" With his back to her, he flashed her a thumbs up as he turned the corner. Mary swung around and headed for the room with the Pyxis machine. When she got there, another nurse was ahead of her, already pulling meds. Right then, her cell rang. It was Carol, the team lead. "Mary, I have another patient for you. Cindy's putting him in room 5. He's a 26-year-old male having severe abdominal pains. His vital signs are stable, but he's in a lot of pain and will need an assessment pretty soon. I'll get him settled for you." Mary shook her head as she took a deep breath. "Got it," then flipped her phone shut. She turned her attention to the nurse at the machine who was carefully documenting her pick. "Luann, I've got to get meds for 3 patients here. Could you hurry, please?" Luann turned and gave her a look that could kill, quickly finished drawing her meds and walked out, but not without saying under her breath, "You think you're the only one who's stressed around here?" Mary didn't have time to get into it with her. She punched in her password, quickly tried to put in the patient names and pull her drugs. Mrs. Sanders wasn't in the computer yet, so she pulled the drugs under Mr. Scott's name. It was easier than trying to bypass the machine. "I'll fix this later," she said to herself. She hurried and distributed the medications and rushed down the hall to check on her new patient. Almost immediately upon taking the medication, Mr. Scott didn't feel right. Having suffered from an allergic reaction, he recognized the symptoms immediately and got up and staggered out in the hall where he collapsed. Another nurse on the unit was just emerging from a room down the hall and saw him fall and called for assistance.
Right. I'm gonna, so there's our story. And we also have some debrief polling questions. This was story 115 for those of you that have used StoryCare. It's just one of the many stories that are in the StoryCare library. This particular story is called Shortcutting Safety. So there's lots going on here. And I think we purposely chose this story because of what we see as a lot of multitasking going on, a tremendous workload spikes that are happening in our currently in our system due to the COVID-19. And I'm going to throw up one of the first, I would call it debrief or reflection question. So here's a great way for us to think about how we would reflect on what we just saw. There isn't really a right answer. There's just some primary answers here. But it's going to be interesting to see what everyone thinks about this first poll. So I've just launched the first poll, so feel free to participate. We'll leave that open here for a moment and allow you to go ahead and answer these questions. The question is, what was your primary learning outcome from this story? And going back to what Mary said, you know, everyone's going to have a little bit different experience with this story. And again, how they would, in fact, respond to that is going to be different. So what is your primary learning outcome from this story, or what could you learn from this story? So feel free to place your answer or vote in there for what you felt was one of the choice one, that medication safety never happens in a static environment. So again, that's more of a process question, you know, and how we do our protocols. Also, there's workload spikes. We see a lot of coming in that area. Before, all of this happened, there's a little bit of a workaround that occurs. There's also this idea of how do we get help. I think I counted a total of 4 patients that Mary was dealing with simultaneously. There may have been many others that were there in her care as well. So lots going on in this particular story. And for as we get our answers coming in, we'll kind of share what the different perspectives look like here for that story. Also, there's always the 5 rights and other medications administration safety measures that are in place as well that can be at play. And so how you shape this particular story debrief or story reflective question really will be dependent upon the type of nurse learner that you're working with, whether you're in a pre-licensure or graduate. It could be that you might want to focus more on the charge nurse, even Mary's supervisor, the person who is helping to manage all of the activity around this particular case. So I'm going to end the polling here. We got some other questions as well, and kind of let you see what you all voted and how you voted around this particular question. This is a great one. Gwen or Mary, we kind of came up with lots of different, probably the highest ones we saw is difficult very difficult to launch. We've got all the polling questions coming up. Okay, so we'll go ahead and go through the first one. So the first one says, the answer there, anybody, Gwen or Mary, would you want to comment on the first question around it's more difficult to ask for help than offer help in this case?
This is Gwen, and I'll make a comment on that, because one of the things that we have talked about so much in QSEN is being able to self-awareness, so that you are able to recognize what your limits are. And these stories are really great for teaching team steps. Most nurse educators, I think, are familiar with team steps, which you can get from AHRQ for free. And that's one of the points in team steps. One of the major pillars is situation monitoring. And that's being aware of the environment so that you recognize when a team member is overloaded. And so through mutual support, then you offer help. So that's just a really important principle in patient safety.
And another one here on the second question is, why is it more difficult to follow established safety protocols during high workload periods? Here, really time became the major thought process of the folks that were on the, that were responding to this particular question. Mary or Gwen, any thoughts on that one as we think about the pressure we're under? We kind of started out, Mary, thinking about how things may be different for our nurses out there on the front line right now as it relates to time.
Yes, I would like to say that it was just really impactful to hear the background noise in the story, all that kind of chatter and other things that were happening. And I was actually getting a little anxious.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, gosh, this would be great to debrief with the students and say, yeah, you know, you're going to have times when you're feeling really anxious, and you really need to be aware of that and know that that is a vulnerable time for making errors, and where you really have to put some shields up to how will you function in a more clear and concise way and accurate way. So I really thought that that was another aspect of the story that is important to debrief. That isn't usually what we do in teaching, but you know, is such an important pearl that that is often missed in our teaching, but that could be some secret sauce to helping our new graduates to cope and stay with nursing. As we all know, so many new nurses leave nursing very early on, and I think in preparing them in, you know, with these ways is important. And also I noticed the bullying of the nurse before her on the PIC6, that, you know, I think we can be honest with nurses and say, okay, you may have not experienced one of these nurses during your clinicals to date, but these nurses are out there. Now, what do you get, you know, how are we going to handle that? You know, how, so that the new nurse doesn't see those bullies as something directed exactly personally at them, but just that we have these challenges in our work and that we have to have strategies. So this story really provided a lot of dialogue that goes beyond the content, but to also these other areas that are important to nursing and skills and competencies.
Yeah, Gwen, I was also wondering if you could comment on just the sheer number of interruptions that this nurse had going on. I think we think of when we teach a policy or a protocol, or, you know, say a checklist, for instance, it looks fairly, you know, intuitive, right? It's just step by step by step. But we, like Mary said, you've got all that sound going on, all of those distractions going on. And then, you know, the tension that's also in play here too, and the multitasking. Any thoughts on that? And just the sheer number of interruptions that prevent you from, you know, completing the task you as the human were trying to do accurately and safely.
Yes. In fact, there's a good bit of research on how to recover from interruptions and how to manage that. You know, some strategies that have been used is nurses who are on units might wear an orange vest or something that identifies them as in a high-risk activity, such as medication administration. But what about calling for a team huddle? This was an environment that was almost out of control. And while it is a reality quite often in ER situations, unfortunately, how can you use the mindful practice of just calling for a team huddle, 30 seconds to just say who's doing what, and to check in. Is the nurse at a point that she can take that new admit, or is that the time that we need to go out of order and someone else take the new admit? But interruptions are something that we need to be teaching learners. And I saw a question come in on chat about leveling the stories. The stories are not per se leveled, but we can pick and choose what elements of a story that we use depending on the learner. I have used the same story with pre-licensure students in a classroom setting that I've used in workshops in working in hospital settings with practicing nurses. And it's about how you use the story and what elements that you pick from within the story. So in this story, you could go to a high level of practice, perhaps even nurse practitioners and how you manage complex work environments. And you could also pick elements around just medication administration as the primary learning if this was a pre-licensure student. So I think you pick the story, pick the learning activity and the objective that you want to accomplish for the lesson that you're trying to, for what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you. And I thought also the point in the last question of how could this medication be avoided? I mean, that's what we all are looking for. This was preventable, but understanding that there was a system breakdown. I think the idea about a huddle, and that, bringing that in, getting everyone on the same page, also leveling the playing field here. Maybe there's someone who has a little bit more bandwidth than Mary did in this case, that they could come and help, and that they would help to ensure that, no matter what, we've got to follow these 5 rights, and would that be someone that would even ensure that I do that, being my backup, my double check, on this. So great questions to from our great answers and from our polling, and we'll kind of move on to the next slide here now. So pretty simple, just a few minutes. We took probably for the debrief, I'm looking at my watch, probably about the whole thing was 10 to 15 minutes. That's pretty typical with stories like this. The story's about 4 minutes, get a lot of learning going. I think some people have mentioned too about how they've used some of the breakout rooms in some of the virtual technologies, platforms like Zoom or GoToMeeting or some of the Teams. And Gwen mentioned that in her slide too, of being able to do that. So you could have gone out here. There was even an informatics or technology situation with the Pyxis, where it actually allowed us to do some things that we had to do to make this work. We had to improvise because the patient actually had come through the ER, wasn't in the system already. So some great things that we could use here. And there was patient-centered care. We even saw that one of our patients, their family members were, pressuring the team for more information. So how do you manage that and manage those resources? So again, great debrief, everyone. Thanks for that and taking the time. So I'm just going to kind of, bring us up and bring us over to the finish line here as we get close to our time. But I think what we were sharing today really is why a story-based learning now, and especially where you can get access to stories, in a virtual and use them in a virtual environment. Well, we know that these align with the QSEN competencies, the AACN essentials. We also really believe that stories are the core. I think like Gwen said in their study that they shared at Chapel Hill with Dr. Ye as well, is that everything started in that cycle with the story. And so, and as Mary said, it's the narrative that gives us this rich experience and allows us to do this quick reflection that we've just done to bring from our own personal experiences and from our newly learned experiences of how we could reflect on this and change practice and prevent, in this case, a medication error from occurring. And we're going to improve our learning outcomes because of the chance of being able to put ourselves and immerse ourselves even in an audio story capability where we use our most powerful simulator, maybe our own brains, to be able to put us in a place, in a setting, and be able to get that outcome of a more immersed learning. Students really love this type of learning, like Mary said, and Gwen said, about flipping that classroom around. There's this virtual capability. And for those that have been keeping up on from the QSEN newsletter standpoint and some of the ways we've been sharing this kind of came about too with the ability to share StoryCare out with the faculty and students in a free trial. Really, we were responding at Synensys and with our partner Ideas out of Orlando, which is one of our partners in building StoryCare, former Disney company, who I know a little bit about story, if you will. And the idea being is that this was a time where we just didn't want to hold back. We wanted to make tools available to those that needed those tools on the front line of education with this very rapidly changing educational environment that we have. So, again, just to share with you just quickly that if you are interested in tapping into Story 115 or many of the other hundreds of stories that are on StoryCare, please, reach out to us. You can go to join.storycare.com, and there's a little Learn More tab on there, and you can kind of signal us from there that you may want to try this out. We've decided to continue to offer the free access to StoryCare system through the end of August, so that faculty could take a look at this and potentially set this up as a way to use this as you go forward in the fall. We also are building some stories that will be launched in the fall around COVID response. I think that would be, all of our team is, and everything we're getting from our community of users is that, this is, we need content that's now and contextual. And also, if you just have questions for us, you can contact us at info@storycare.com. That's a way to email us if you just want to email us. But also, just going on to StoryCare, you can learn a little bit more. It's very compatible no matter where you're learning from. Today, we were just using on a laptop, but you can use this on a tablet, or even we heard students love to just be able to pack it on their phone and be able to take a quick listen to the stories maybe while they're on the treadmill or working out or doing other things as they move around in this new classroom environment. So with that, I'd like to really thank everyone today for participating. We're going to hang around and do a few answering the questions as you have them, and kind of keep the chat moving along as well. If you want to hang on a couple more minutes, we'll try to get to some of that chat, both from Mary and from Gwen and myself as we go along. And like I said, we'll be able to share this with all of those that have been on this. If you want to access this link and this webinar, please feel free to do so. And we hope that you'll take us up on the offer to try it out with your students. And if not, this learning platform, again, just using that narrative story to really enrich the experience that your students are looking for, and also to use some of these methods that our faculty have talked about today as a way of meeting this virtual need that we have to continue to deliver quality education to our nurses in a time where the classroom setting has been very disrupted, as Mary and Gwen have talked about today. So thank you again, and thanks for joining us on our webinar. And I'll be ending the webinar at this time. Thank you again.